In this exercise, we're going to be creating a photo story by finding 3 related images and treating and enhancing them so that they all fit together. Okay, so we're going to learn some really powerful photo correction tools, but in order to do that, we first have to find 3 photos that are a little bit imperfect. So sites like Unsplash are actually not that great for this particular assignment because a lot of the photos on there have been, very meticulously treated by the photographer that took them. So Pexels is a little bit better because it, sources from all over the web. So there are some really great photos on here, and then there's some other photos that need just a little bit of help. So this could be a place that you look. But one source that I really like for this assignment is Flickr, which is a place where a bunch of people share their images. There's actually a special feature on Flickr that allows you to source for Creative Commons images, which are images that you can download the full resolution version of. So if you go to Flickr and type something into the search, let's search for Grand Canyon. Okay, so when I search that, I get a bunch of Grand Canyon photos, but there's this little thing here that says any license, and if I click on that, I can go down to all Creative Commons. So these are images that people have tagged to allow everyone to use them for certain purposes. And you can read more about Creative Commons licenses. In this case, since we're just using it internally, it's going to be fine to use these images. And we are able to download the full resolution version of everything that's here. So for instance, if I click on this image, which is a pretty nice landscape, okay, I can click on this little download button, and you can see that it'll allow me to download any size, including the original, which is 4,000 by almost 3,000. So that's like a 12 megapixel image. So that's going to be definitely large enough for what we're doing here. I went ahead and found 3 sort of images from a music show. Okay, so I have one of this singer, and you can see that this image definitely needs a lot of help. It's very noisy. It's a lot of color noise, and it's a little too dark. This image of a guitarist playing an acoustic guitar, and then a zoom in on the acoustic guitar neck itself. Okay, so I'm going to use these 3 images and make them feel cohesive. So let's go ahead and open up Photoshop. And we're going to be working with something called Artboards. Really important for this assignment to learn Artboards. It's actually a pretty new feature in Photoshop, and it's a super powerful way to work. So let's go ahead and click on Create New. For this particular assignment, we want to work in pixels, and we're creating 1200 by 800 pixel images. Okay, so make sure you type in 1200 pixels for the width and 800 pixels for the height. For resolution, we'll put 300. Okay, and then the background contents, it actually doesn't matter. We can just put white. But the important thing is that you click on Artboards. Okay, so this is really important. This is going to give us the ability to create multiple artboards within the document. So let's leave that checked and then click on Create. Okay, so in Photoshop here, you can see that it looks pretty normal, but up, in our canvas, it says Artboard 1. Okay, so if I zoom out just a bit and click on where it says Artboard 1, I get these extra tools. So this is actually the Artboard tool, which is hidden underneath the Move tool. Okay, and when we're working with artboards, we can create multiple regions, just like we do in Illustrator to, work with multiple images at a time. So let's go ahead and click the plus button here. And when I do that, you can see I create a copy of the previous artboard. Okay, and I want 3 copies for this assignment. So let me go ahead and create a third. And now I'm working with 3 artboards. And if I zoom out, I can see all 3 at once. You can also work with the artboard tool to create other artboard shapes. That's up to you. So however you want to organize your artboards in the big document is totally up to you. Okay, but in this case, got 3 artboards, all the same size, all 1200 by 800, which is what I want for this assignment. So let's go ahead and pull in those images that we're working with. So I'm going to bring up the Finder. Okay, so this is the folder where I have those images, and I can just go ahead and drag them in. Okay, so since I had the 3rd artboard selected, it dragged it into that 3rd artboard. And when you do this, you're going to get this little thing at the top to transform this in any size you want. Okay, so just transform it and crop it how you want to crop it within that artboard, and then click the little check here to confirm that transformation. Okay, let's select the second artboard, and you can do this either by just clicking on the second artboard or in the layers panel, clicking on the artboard that you want. Okay, so the artboards are actually going to organize all the layers within that artboard, similar to how the layers panel normally works, but it's just an extra grouping for each of those artboards. So let's click the second artboard, go back to our Finder, and we'll drag in our second image. Okay, once again, I'm just going to crop that however I want. And then the first artboard, going to do the same. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now that we have our images in the artboards, we're ready to start bringing them together so that they form a cohesive story. And I like the contents of the image. We're working with 3 related things, where it's musicians and instruments. So those contents are already feeling closely connected, but the way the images are treated are not. So there are different properties of photographs that make up the way it looks. So things like how bright or how dark the image is, or how contrasty the image is, or things like color balance and saturation. And right now those things are not all aligned. For instance, in this third artboard, this image is darker than the other ones, and it's a little bit too orange. Actually, all these images are skewing a little bit towards the yellow-orange side. Okay, so we might want to bring that to make it a little more neutral. But particularly this third image is very orange and almost a little red. So we want to take out some of that intense color and get it to be a little closer to what's happening in the others. Okay, so different ways that you can do that. We could definitely use the adjustment layers that we've been using so far. I can go ahead and just click on any artboard. And let's say I wanted to lighten this up. I could go down to create a levels adjustment layer and bring up the white point and the midtones to just lighten that up. And if I turn this off and on, you can see that that is starting to get closer to the others. You can also do things like use hue and saturation to desaturate this layer. Okay, since it's a little bit too bright in its color, you can do that, and that's going to help bring it in line. Okay, so again, you can see that if I turn those 2 layers off and then turn them back on, this is definitely feeling better matched to the other images. So that's one way we can work, and that's how we've been working so far. It's a really good way to do it. But I want to show you some filters that are going to help you do some similar things. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete both of those adjustment layers. And instead of using adjustment layers, I'm going to select this and go up to filter. Okay, and then I'm going to go to convert for smart filters, but in this case it's grayed out, and that's because I'm already ready to use smart filters. Okay, so this is a smart object. I can tell by the little icon that's here. We'll talk more about smart objects soon, but since it's a smart object, I don't need to convert for smart filters. But if you're not using a smart object and this convert to smart filters is not grayed out, make sure you select that, because that's going to allow us to work in a non-destructive way. Okay, so convert for smart filters is important. Okay, since we're not going to do that, let's instead go down to camera raw filter. Okay, so this is the first thing I want to show you, and it's incredibly powerful. It's one of the best features in Photoshop, in my opinion, for this type of editing. Okay, and since we're working with artboards, it's a little bit weird because it's going to actually show us the entire image space. So we can just go ahead and zoom in to center the image that we're working on in this dialog. Okay, so when you use camera raw filter, this dialog box is going to pop up on top of what you're doing, and at the top it says camera raw. Okay, so there's a bunch of adjustments in here. This is actually based off of the camera raw plugin. This used to be a plugin that would help you edit photos straight out of the camera, but they've converted it into a filter because the tools in here are so incredibly powerful that people want to use it, outside of processing those camera shots. Okay, so let's just go ahead and talk about some of the things in this panel over here. And there are a bunch of tabs. Okay, so there's a lot of tools located in this panel, but we're just going to talk about a few of them. Most of what you want is in the basic tab. Okay, so if you have basic selected, these tools here are going to help you make adjustments to the basic exposure of your image. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about color balance, because this is definitely something that needs improving in this shot. Like I said, it's too yellow, it's too orange, it's almost a little bit red. Okay, so we're going to be able to adjust that to make it feel more natural. There's 2 components to color balance. One is the color temperature, the other one is the color tint. Okay, so color temperature is this thing that goes between blue and yellow. So if you have a very warm color temperature, it actually has a lot of yellow in it. If you have a very cool color temperature, it has a lot of blue in it. So we can manipulate this slider to neutralize what's happening in here. So if I start to slide the slider towards the blue section, okay, I'm going to strip some yellows out of the image. And we're going to want to do that because, like I said, this is a little bit too orangey. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit more towards the blue section. And then for tint, if we go a little bit towards the green section, okay, I'm going to start to take out some of those magentas. Okay, so you can see that a combination between those two, and I mostly want to work with color temperature. Okay, that's going to start giving me something that's a little bit more natural. Okay, there we go. And I don't want to go too far. I just want to take a little bit of that color out. Okay, so then let's also play around with the saturation, which is at the bottom. Okay, so I can turn down the saturation just a bit. And that color feels a little more natural to me than the original, because the original was too orangey. This color balance just feels a little bit more correct. Okay, let's talk about exposure, which is how bright or dark the image is. Okay, so since it's a little bit dark, let's go ahead and bump that exposure up just a bit. There we go. And we can also turn up the contrast. Okay, so contrast is the differences between lights and darks. So you can see if I turn contrast down, it gets kind of flat and gray. If I turn it up, it gets super punchy, where the blacks are really rich and the whites are really bright. Okay, so that's going too far. Let's just bump it up a little bit to get a little bit more of that contrast. Okay, and then highlights and shadows allow you to adjust the exposure, but they're only going to target a very specific part of the image. Okay, so if I bring shadows up, basically I'm targeting the darker parts of the image and making those darker parts brighter. Okay, so anytime I slide this over to the right, I'm going to make it brighter. Anytime I slide it to the left, I'm going to make it darker. So if I take shadows and move it to the left, I'm actually taking the dark parts of the image and making them even darker. Okay, so in this case, I think bumping up the shadows a little bit is going to give me some of the detail in that shot. Okay, and then same with highlights. If I want to make the bright parts even brighter, I can move this up, and you can see that that's making that highlight almost kind of blinding. If I turn it down, it's going to sort of dim down that highlight. In this case, I think the highlights up just a little bit to get more of the contrast in there is going to help. Okay, and whites and blacks are similar to highlights and shadows, but they're just a little bit more on the extreme end of things. Okay, so whites are really going to bump up that white highlight. It's also going to lift up the entire image because it's very similar to the white point and the black point when you're using the levels tool. Okay, and then with blacks, I can either bring this up or bring it down to really crush the blacks to get some of that rich contrast. In this case, I think the blacks are pretty much good, near zero. Okay, and then lastly, I have clarity, and clarity is one of those things that is best used in moderation, okay? Particularly when you're working with people, it can create a lot of mid-tone contrast, and it's good for bringing out details, but it also can make things look a little fake if you go too high. So definitely play around with this slider. You can see if I slide it down, things look kind of mushy. If I slide it too far up, things look a little too crispy and a little bit unnatural. Okay, so up to you to find the right balance of clarity. But generally speaking, you're going to want to be between like -10 and +30 clarity. You're not going to want to venture outside of that too often because that'll probably be a little too extreme. Okay, so this is looking a little bit better. We're starting to bring out some of the more natural colors from this image. Let's go to a few images, or a few tabs over to detail. Okay, because there's a few things in here that I want to show you. Starting with noise reduction. Okay, so this is actually a really noisy image. You can see that there's a lot of that digital noise that's being created from the sensor. Okay, that's because this is shot in a very low light environment. You might have noticed if you ever take images with a smartphone in a really dark bar or some kind of dark indoor environment, you'll get this same kind of effect. And there are some features in Photoshop that will help you reduce this noise. Okay, so you can see that there's kind of two issues here. One is that it's very speckled. There's a very grainy texture to this. And luminance will help you get rid of that grainy texture. So if I slide the luminance slider up, you can see that that is starting to smooth out some of that grain. Okay, so if I smooth it up, if I go up too high, you can see it's going to get way too smooth, and it's going to start to just iron out all the details. So you want to be careful with this. A lot of times a little bit goes a long way. Okay, so let's just turn that up a little bit. Then the other issue is all the color noise, and this is particularly true if I zoom in. You can see that there's all these like random colors that are happening in the image. Okay, that is another problem that is being caused by the sensor. And the second slider that says color is going to help you reduce that particular problem. Okay, so you can see when I slide that up, okay, if I zoom in on this and go back down to 0, you can see it's very color speckles, doesn't look natural. And if I slide the color noise reduction up, okay, it's going to help reduce that color noise. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Again, you don't want to go too far because if you go really far, it's going to start interfering with the colors in the image. So you want to go up just enough so that it starts to look a little more natural. So definitely play around with a combination of those two sliders. You can also play around with the detail and the contrast in these as well. So sometimes bringing the contrast back in can really help, or playing with the amount of detail that's left in the image. But a lot of times the presets on those are pretty good. So usually just the luminance and the color sliders are enough to get the effect you want. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Definitely a large improvement over the original, which was very, very noisy. Okay, and this image is also a little soft. And so up above we have this area called sharpening, and this will help us sharpen up the image. And it can't make up for an image that is just shot out of focus. You know, there are limitations to this, because it's not actually going to sharpen the image, but it will make the image sort of look sharper. Okay, so again, if I go to the amount slider and just increase this, okay, this is going to add some sharpening to the image. So you can see at 50, things look a little bit more crisp, particularly if you focus on the eyes and the hair. Turn that back down to 0. See, that just gets a little bit softer. Okay, so a lot of times adding a little bit of sharpening, particularly to counteract some of the noise reduction that you've done, will help bring some quality back into that. Okay, there we go. That looks good. Okay, so that looks pretty good. There are other tools in here, but I'm just going to leave it at those basic tools. Let's go ahead and click OK. Okay, and that's going to apply the filter. And since we are working with smart filters, you can see that there's a little thing that applies underneath the layer that says Smart Filters and Camera Raw Filter. Okay, so if I double click on Camera Raw Filter, you can see it brings me right back into that filter, and I can make adjustments to any of the adjustments that I made. And that's why smart filters are so important, because if we didn't have, you know, our image ready for smart filters, this filter would have burned right into the image, and we wouldn't be able to go back and make adjustments. So now that I'm back here, I can turn the Camera Raw Filter on and off to see the before and after. Okay, you can see that before it was really dark, really orangey. After, it looks a lot more natural. Okay, so that is looking much better. It feels like a more high quality image. Let's do the same for the other images as well. Okay, so let's go to Artboard. Artboard 2. Okay, and I'm going to select this image. It's already ready for smart filter, so I'm just going to go right down to the Camera Raw Filter. Okay, once again, I'm going to zoom in on this, and let's just make some basic corrections. This image looks much better. It's not really noisy or anything, but it does look, you know, a little bit too yellow. So let's go ahead and drag that temperature down to get some of those blues back. There we go, and it might also be a little bit green, so I'm going to slide it into the magenta. Okay, and let's brighten up the shadows a little bit in this case, and just turn down the saturation. I think it's a little oversaturated. It feels a bit unnatural to me. There we go. So you can just play around with these different sliders to get the effect you want. I think just a little bit brighter is probably good. Okay, so that all looks good. Clarity, I think we can leave as it is. Okay, again, I don't want to bring clarity too far up because it'll make things look kind of plasticky. Okay, so let's just leave clarity pretty much at 0. And let me show you another thing that you can do, you know, in Camera Raw Filter, and that can be done in the Effects tab. Okay, so a couple different things you can do. One is you can add grain. Okay, so you know, even though we spend a lot of time trying to get rid of the noise, sometimes you actually want to add grain in for a certain effect. Definitely be subtle with it, but sometimes a little bit of grain can actually make things look a little sharper and give a certain vintage quality to images. So if you want to play around with adding grain, you can definitely play around with that. There's also vignetting. Okay, so if you want to add vignetting to an image, this will help you just sort of darken the edges a little bit to get sort of a halo effect in the image itself. Okay, so this will help you kind of do that, and you can see that if I turn this up, it'll actually give me negative vignetting. So usually you want to just bring this down a little bit to kind of darken those corners just a touch. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and click OK. And again, you can see that the before and after, it's helped us, kind of get rid of some of that yellow quality, and it feels a little more connected to that other image. So let's do the final image really quick. This one looks pretty close, but definitely a little too yellow. Go back into camera raw filter. Okay, here we go. And again, let's get rid of a little bit of the yellow quality. I think it's also a little bit green, so I'm just going to slide it a little bit towards the magenta end. Okay, and then let's add a bit of contrast, and I also think turn down the saturation of this as well. Okay, a little bit of clarity I think in this case too, and we'll just lift up the shadows just a bit. Okay, that looks good, and there we go. So now you can see that the three images, not only do they match in terms of content, but they match in terms of style. So this is looking really good. A couple other filters I want to show you really quick. Let's go back to this original. We did some sharpening within the camera raw filter, but I will also want to show you that there is this sharpen tab under filter, and there are some different options here. Unsharp mask is very similar to the sharpen that is in camera raw filter. Okay, so if you don't want to use camera raw filter, unsharp mask is a way to apply sharpening without that. Okay, so you can turn up the radius to create a stronger sharpening effect. Generally speaking, you're going to want to leave it between like 0.5 pixel and 2 pixels. Don't turn this up too much, otherwise you're going to create really weird stuff. Okay, so keep that usually around 1, and then the amount is how much of a sharpening effect to apply. You can always click preview on and off to see the effect. So you can see that a little bit of sharpening is help bringing out the details in the eyes there. Okay, so I think in this case a little bit more sharpening on this image could actually help. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that. You can see that it's going to pop up in our smart filters. So if I want to undo that effect, I can always double click on this and change the values in there. Or I can always just hide that particular filter or turn it back on to change the visibility of it. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another filter I want to show you is that you can add noise to the images as well. Okay, so we added a little bit of noise to this, and in a way that's helping because there's a lot of natural noise in our first image. Okay, so that's helping unify it. This last image is really smooth, so I think a little bit of noise could help here. So let's go ahead and select that, and then go up to filter and down to noise, and we can go to add noise. Okay, so a few different kinds of noise. If you uncheck monochromatic, you're going to get color noise, which usually you don't want. Okay, so this is kind of like the reverse of when we were doing the color noise cleanup. Okay, this is going to sort of add that color noise. So usually you want to keep monochromatic checked so that you don't get that. Okay, and then you can just play around with the different amounts. Obviously, if you turn this high, it's going to get really out of control. So usually you want to keep it pretty low. And once again, you can uncheck preview to see the difference. And you can see that it's creating just a little bit of green in there. That's going to help give it a similar quality to the other images. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And you can always use these in conjunction with adjustment layers as well. So this is actually looking a little bit more saturated than the other images. Okay, so let's go up to Artboard, and let's actually just add a hue saturation adjustment layer and turn down the saturation a little bit more. There we go. So that's taking out some of those really warm tones. Okay, so this is looking really good. I think these are ready to go. This is the type of image story you should be looking to create. Okay, so 3 images related in content, and then use these correction tools, particularly the camera raw filter, to really bring them together and enhance and correct some of the issues in the photographs. So you have a few tools that you can use now to do this. Now that these are ready, let's go ahead and export them for this assignment. And Artboards actually helps us export these in a way that's a little bit more easy. Okay, so we can go up to File and down to Export and Export As. When we do that, it's going to bring up a dialog with all 3 of these images. Okay, and for all these, we can choose different formatting options. So let's choose JPEG, and you actually want to do that on all 3. Okay, and you can select more than one at a time if you just hold down Shift. Okay, so if I hold down Shift and click on the bottom, I can select all 3 and then go down to JPEG. Okay, and then you can also choose the quality. Okay, so this is the amount of compression that's going to be added to the final image. And you can actually, look to see what the effect of this is. If I zoom in, Okay, if I go up to 100% compression, it's going to look, or sorry, not 100% compression, but 100% quality. It's going to look very high quality. Okay, but if I slide this down to 0%, you're going to get some of those weird compression artifacts that you sometimes see in really low quality images. It's going to help reduce the file size, but it's usually not going to be worth it to go this low on the quality. So generally speaking, somewhere between 50 and 90% is the sweet spot, but you can kind of explore what it looks like in different areas. If you're exporting this for a website, you might take more of a hit to the quality in order to reduce that file size a bit more. Since we're just turning these images in, we don't care too much about the file size, so I'm going to go ahead and go with 90% quality. You can see that increases the file size quite a bit compared to 50%. Okay, so it's almost 5 times larger to go to 90% compared to 50%, but in this case, it is probably going to be worth it since we're not really concerned about the size of the images. Okay, so when you're ready to go, you can click Export All and export them to whatever folder you want, and you're ready to turn them in for this assignment right after you just name them to the right names.